Hi there. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this last panel session where we hopefully can have a bit more of an interactive aspect to get thoughts from experts in the field, as well as from the different presenters from the earlier sessions and audience members from those earlier sessions. I should state that we are recording this session as we have done with others, and ask that you all submit questions through the Q&A box throughout the session, including who the question is for, and we will take all of those questions after we've had some initial thoughts from the panel members. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name is George Vassilev, and I am the Head of Human Capital, Economic Wellbeing and Digital Transformation at ONS, the Office for National Statistics, and I've been here for just over 5 years. So within my team's remit is around developing all of our official statistics and analysis on human capital, so people's skills and knowledge and how that enables them to move into a successful life, whether that's through the labor market or otherwise. And so there's a particular interest I have around extracting skills and skill demands from job vacancies, but through other ways as well. So within this session, the focus is on trying to synthesize the breadth of the information that has been covered from the earlier webinar sessions, also to try and understand the priority from the various panel members as to what are the emerging areas of opportunity to use and work together with this kind of data, and potentially to meet a wider user base, or even to identify what that wider user base is. It's possibly an opportunity as well to consider whether there are any emerging or known concerns or issues with the current use of such data, and whether there's anything we can do collectively as a group and take next steps to tackle them. And linked to that is how we may want to continue engagement on this as a group going forward with a UK policy focus, but potentially other means as well. So in terms of the format, I have some questions trying to open up the discussion really to the panel members, and we'll introduce each one in a second. But it's a very large important part is for you to get involved and ask the questions that you think are appropriate, either for the specific panel members or for the group as a whole. So with that in mind, we'll open up to the floor probably around 4 o'clock, maybe a little bit earlier, depending on the questions that we have. And then at the end, we will just summarize and thank you all that this is the last session, so there isn't anything that comes afterwards, but just to note that there's sessions in the coming days. So in terms of the panel members, we've got David Freeman, who is the Head of Labour Market and Households at the Office for National Statistics. He's been at the ONS for over 20 years, and as part of the labour market statistics he oversees, one of his teams publishes the results of the ONS Vacancy survey, which asks businesses how many unfilled vacancies they are actively recruiting for. The particular interest there is in how online job vacancies data could help us improve the timeliness and granularity of ONS statistics. We also then have Dr. Mariagrazia Squicciarini from the OECD. So she is a senior economist, head of unit within the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. And she leads the work of the Working Party on Industry Analysis and oversees the Directorate's Microdata Lab initiative, which is a long-term project linking big micro-level data sets, including firm IP data, scientific publication data, etc., for analysis and support of evidence-based policymaking. And we've had a slight change in the final panelist. We have Dan Mawson instead of Michael Keegan from BEIS. Dan Mawson is a senior economist at BEIS and heads up the economy team there, which leads on the analysis of the UK and global economy and growth and productivity, which is worked on in various forms, along with industry policy analysis for the last 20 years, both at BEIS and predecessor departments and the Ministry of Defence. In addition to this role, he represents the UK on the OECD Committee for Industry, Innovation and Entrepreneurship, whose working parties are central to the OECD's programme of work to make greater use of vacancies data, and hence the link there. So just open it up to each one of you in turn, maybe in the order I've introduced you as David, Mariagrazia, and Dan. Just to open up the discussion, what do you see as the main untapped opportunities of such data? Similarly, what do you see as the main beneficiaries and outputs from the use of online job advert data, both on the policy side and with other types of users, but also considering what do you see as any of the main obstacles? So if we could perhaps start off with David.
Oh, thank you, Gueorguie, and a really pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm actually sitting for most of the sessions today. Some really fantastic, innovative and interesting work being carried out across the country on this. This is really, really interesting. From my point of view, in terms of reporting on the labour market and trying to tell the labour market story, I think there's probably three opportunities that our online data gives us. Our current vacancy survey, although it gives us quite a good indication of total number of vacancies, only allows us to cut that data by industry and size of business. And there's really three things I think the online data gives us. Firstly, it gives us a lot of other dimensions for the vacancies information, particularly things like geography, occupation, skills level, salary bands. There are many more different ways we can cut vacancies data, which I think is really, really important. Secondly, is the level of granularity it gives us, because when we do the vacancy survey, we just ask the business, well, how many vacancies you're recruiting for. Online data, it gives you the individual vacancies themselves. Therefore, the level of granularity you can get by industry, by all the other variables is much, much improved. And again, gives people a much richer picture of what's happening. And I think thirdly is the timeliness. You've already seen on our website, we're doing some work with Advert. My team's working very closely with Gueorguie's team. And the turnaround time is amazing. We get data scraped on the Friday, and then we publish the aggregates the following Thursday. So really, really timely data. And you can get the granularity at that timeliness. One of the criticisms of some of our data at the regional level is it can take quite a long time to come out. There's a long time like between the reference date and the publication date. With vacancy data, it's down, you're talking about days or weeks rather than months or years. In terms of the beneficiaries, I can see there's a whole range. I mean, firstly is government departments. There's always a demand for vacancies. It's one of the few leading indicators we publish on a monthly basis showing changes in demand in the labour market. So being able to give more granularity, more information, particularly around occupations, region, government are very much in demand for that. Looking beyond central government, I think local government would also be really, really interested in this. You go back about a decade or so, we used to get what's called job centre vacancies. We give you that granularity of occupation and region. We've not been able to publish those for years. And so this gives an opportunity to do things at a local level. So local authorities have a much better idea of what their local labour market is, what interventions potentially are needed. Linked to that is also things like local further education and higher education colleges and training providers, knowing what the demand is for skills within a local area. They can actually start tailoring the courses to meet that demand and providing people with the skills they need. In terms of obstacles, I'm sort of thinking more in terms of challenges rather than obstacles. I think it's probably not insurmountable, but I think there are some interesting things. And one thing that I did pick up in this morning's session was that there's not quite one definitive source of online vacancies. There are some key data sets, Advert, Indeed, Burning Glass, but as one of the speakers this morning said, they all give you slightly different answers because they all catch in slightly different ways. So unlike something like, say, a big administrative data set from government, like VAT or tax data, there's no one definitive data set. So again, not insurmountable. It's still a challenge saying, well, actually, which one is giving you the right answer? I think there's probably challenges as well around perhaps gaps in the data source. I mean, we've already seen when we compare the Advert data we publish with our vacancy survey, some things match quite well, others don't quite match so well. And one of the reasons for that might be that there's some vacancies which aren't advertised online. So you're probably not going to get a definitive answer by just looking at online data. You probably need something like our vacancy survey or some other means of data collection to get that full picture. So that's probably a challenge as well. And probably a third one is around the relationship between, say, government and the data source providers. Most of the data source providers are private companies, the organizations, and so they are trying to make money out of the data set, which is reasonable enough, but how we actually relate with that. And also, if you get third-party data, you also, as a government statistician, we don't have the control over the changes to that data set. So if you're running our own surveys, if you're changing the survey, we know in advance you can make all the adjustments. We're getting a data set in, we have to deal with whatever comes along quite quickly. So again, I think the more challenges rather than obstacles, but I think it's not quite as easy just bringing the data set in. But I think the potential is really fantastic. Yeah, so I'll pass that to Gueorguie.
Thank you, David. Yeah, quite a few follow-up questions we could have there, but I'll probably just pass on to Mariagrazia first for her reflections on those questions around opportunities, beneficiaries, and obstacles.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me today. It's been very interesting as a day, and there is a lot of studies that I really look forward to continue reading more in details. I can't subscribe more to what David just said. So really, we find exactly the same issues. Now, in terms of where the potential lies, well, not only, as was underlined by some of the presenters today, in applying new methodologies in order to look at this data, I really think the goldmine of these data is in the links that can be done to other data sets. And because I think perhaps it is time to debunk a bit the analysis on labor markets and skills and look at it from a different angles, from the demand side. Let's face it, the jobs that are out there, the skills that are demanded depend on the kind of firms that are in countries, their organization, the kind of technologies they develop or adopt, the way they are organized, and the kind of organizational setting. So unless we link these data to data from firms, intellectual property rights, to look at technological development, if you don't look at it from the point of view also, for instance, of trade data to understand better the global value chains and how value is created and where it is appropriated, I think we don't use this data to the highest extent and what can really help us looking at. And this in turn will help us shedding light in a different way and perhaps in a more deep way to the very question of jobs and skills. That will help us also understanding where we are heading to. If we look at these data from the point of view of what are the skills that are demanded, because we know that human capital is a necessary complement to any kind of technological deployment we might think of, or to any organizational setting, of course, it becomes clear the need to also understand, what are the skills that are demanded, as well as the type of jobs and the type of tasks. Because another thing that I think these data can help us doing is really trying to understand whether occupational profiles are changing. When it comes to who can benefit from using this data, who are these data for? Well, I think really a number of stakeholders. I can, of course, see the value added for policymakers. As I said, in different domains, it's not limited to labor market dynamics or skills demand. But I can also see firms. I mean, if I were a firm that has the necessary human capital, and we go back to that point, to use this data suitably, I could check, for instance, whether my competitors are moving in a certain direction by simply looking at what they are posting as jobs, right? Or to see whether the overall profiles of people they are looking for is changing, which will give me an insight into something I wouldn't otherwise know, that is, if they are changing their organization. And of course, by the time you're a leading company, or even if you're not a leading company, that might be an information that is really important. And also, which kind of knowledge repositories they're trying to tap into in terms of skills and competencies. So there is this kind of information that is very useful, not only for policymakers or for statistical offices. And in any case, I would like to add to what David said, by saying that to my mind, these data are a very welcome addition, but at the moment they cannot substitute statistical data collected by statistical offices, because there are some categories that simply don't get advertised online in terms of job posting. So we don't have a clear view, especially for relatively lower skill type of jobs. We don't have that kind of coverage, that kind of representativeness we might want to have. And hence, you know, the necessity to complement it. Of course, there is a granularity, there is a wealth of information that is very difficult to get through survey or statistics generally, but I think it's really a complement, not really a substitute for the moment. And what I think it's a bit sometimes frustrating of using this data, despite, you know, the many things you can do with them, is not knowing how the story ends. That is like, okay, what the actual match looks like. We have seen the job posting. We don't know how many applied, and we don't know who got it. Also because this matters, for instance, by the time people use this data for, say, looking at salaries, because salary is a bargaining process, and we don't know whether what is paid to the worker corresponds to what has been offered to start with. And I take the point of James Neal this morning that said, look at perks, because benefits beyond salaries perhaps are the answer. And this has been unexploited to a great extent for the moment, for what I can see. Now, what are the challenges of using this data? Well, first of all, the cost. David said it. I mean, these data are produced by companies, and companies are out for a business, which means, can we really sustain the cost of this data throughout time? And this data comes with an additional cost that is not paid to these companies, that is IT infrastructure. I mean, in order to process these data, especially by the time one wants to do an analysis across countries, you have to have a serious data infrastructure and support, because otherwise there is no way, especially if you're going through the full text, to do it. And there is also with it the need for suitable human capital, which is not a given again, because we all know there is a shortage of data scientists, although, you know, it's a profession that is growing, but still the demand exceeds for the moment, for what we can see, the supply. And last but not least, going again to a point that David made, is representativeness. That is like, again, we cannot take this data at face value and think they tell the whole story, but we have to be very much aware of what these data can say and cannot say. And I'm not sure that all users are sufficiently sophisticated or aware, actually, to take these things into account. Now, when these analyses are done for policy reasons, that matters a lot, actually. And I will leave it here for the moment.
Thank you, Mariagrazia. Yeah, I think we'll definitely be picking up on the representativeness point again. I just wanted to, again, pass over to Dan Mawson to see his reflections on those three first questions.
Thanks, Gueorguie. I think I'm going to echo a lot of what David and Mariagrazia said, so I'll try and keep mine quite short. So I think in terms of the main opportunities, like, first off, it's fast. I mean, it's almost sort of incomparably faster compared to most mainstream economic statistics we get. It's virtually real time, and as David said, with a lot of granularity at the same time. And certainly this year, that speed has been incredibly useful in dealing with the challenges of COVID, because genuinely ministers are having to think about what is going on in the world on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis. Secondly, I'd say it's about flexibility. So it's very easy to think about the vacancies data and thinking, oh, this just tells us lots about labour markets. Well, it doesn't, because job vacancies hold such a rich repository of information on skills, location, sector, etc. It allows you to get into an awfully large amount of other topics very easily, because it's fundamental. You can't do work without hiring people. And therefore, the people you hire tell other people things about the work you're doing. Thirdly, and it's almost surreal, this is the third one, is it gets into the demand side of labour markets, which is not really something we're great at in terms of having statistical coverage. We have lots on like supply of skills and who's out there, what qualifications they have, but it's rare to have really good information on what firms actually really want and need at the time. In terms of beneficiaries, it's got an awful lot of applications across all of government, but I'm going to pick out one which is a slightly different perspective, which is I think there's a real value here for analysts because it makes us think differently about the world. Because it's a slightly different data source which can tell us lots of interesting things, but not just about labour markets. So it requires us to learn new analytical techniques and not just fall back on old approaches. But equally, it forces into a mode of thinking a lot more about how markets work. So vacancies are a literal signal about what firms are doing, what employees want, or at least what firms think employees want, and how the two look for each other. And that's really great at getting into the whole matching process of what labour markets do in a way which we haven't really been able to do previously in any decent sense. In terms of challenges, I think the points about data quality and consistency, which we've made, are very important, in particular in the sense of, as Mariagrazia said, the real long-term value of this is triangulating it with other data sources so you can then see how this all knits in together. And that then raises questions about market concentration and lock-in. There are only a few firms who do this. We've got lots of different versions of the truth. And then how do you link this into national stats in the long run to become like a core data repository for work going forward?
Thank you, Dan. No, that's great. As you say, it's there's a lot of the benefits and the beneficiaries. There's a lot of commonality across the different users, so that's really, really helpful to see. I think I wanted to pick up the point that was raised kind of across the three of you about representativeness, as in a way that's one of the challenges. You highlighted that it's not necessarily insurmountable. So I think it was just to delve a little bit more into that point as to how could it be tackled in a way that is meaningful for the way that people want to use it, but also actually when might it not be a challenge? Some of the sessions that we saw earlier today didn't rely on the data being representative in order to still extract insights from them, whether that's in terms of linking to skill commonality across jobs and basically not requiring the volume of adverts to be representative of the total volume of vacancies across the UK. So two aspects really. What can we really do to get at the point of representativeness, and when might it not be an issue? Mariagrazia, do you want to pick up on that point first, perhaps?
Yes, why not? Thanks a lot. So actually we did some work at OECD in order to assess the representativeness. Now, the first thing we thought of course, was to compare it with official statistics about vacancies. Then we found the first challenge, that is the way in which vacancies are defined differs across countries. I mean, remember, we're talking about an organization that has a mission, the fact of doing comparative analysis across countries. So evidently the kind of challenges multiply across countries, although of course we can learn a lot, something that perhaps if we were to look within a certain country only, we would never see. So that's a first question. So then the best way we thought we could do that was to check as a proportion of the number of employees per year, assuming that there can be only so much turnover on the labor market, and checking, let's say, the proportion of vacancies that appeared on online job platforms, related data, as compared to the levels. Now, of course, it's a bit comparing apples with pears. We are fully aware of that, but we thought it was the best way we could get at the question. And already that actually provided us with very interesting information. As for instance, in one of the countries we analyzed, we saw that in some cases there seemed to be, for some occupation, even more job openings than actual employees in that year. Now, thinking that people are going to, all people in a certain occupational category are going to change their job every year, it's a bit heroic. So it already gives you a bit of a sense of what this data can do and what this data cannot do. Having said that, perhaps if you saw in the work that Leah presented, for instance, by the time you're looking at skills and jobs related to AI, given that really AI lives in the digital environment, of course, this data is perfectly suitable for that kind of a question. One thing that nevertheless was pointed out today, both by Neil and also by Daphne, and I really liked it as they put it, is like, okay, free text, after all, is not really a fantastic thing. That is like what you end up getting there is the fact that you have texts that are enormous, plenty of description, creative wording, and texts that are really short and makes comparison very, very difficult. Also because by the time you try to get at the skills, for instance, required for a certain job, that you can't, in the overall analysis, to the same extent, one job posting where you have 1,000 words as compared to one job posting, say, even in the same occupational category, where you have 10 words, right? And you don't wait, and you don't know where the, let's say, the weight of that job posting is. So this is also another problem related to how to get at the challenges of this data. And in terms of the representativeness, let's not forget that very seldom, not always, in the job posting, there is the kind of a declaration of which kind of occupation we are talking about. This is most often inferred by the company treating the data, which means that to start with, we can have misalignment by using one source or another. And in any case, it depends on the type of algorithms that themselves have built to do this. And of course, we have no way to know the recipe of this. So we don't have an insight into the cooking, how this thing is done, which of course then might lead to different weighting schemes to be applied or different inferences to be made out of what we see.
Thank you, Mariagrazia. Yeah, no, some useful reference to other work you've done, as you say, to compare to other official sources. And I can understand when you're looking across multiple countries, thankfully that's not a challenge we have to hit a lot of the time, but I can understand the extra level that comes to. David or Dan, did you want to come in on that point around representativeness when it might not be an issue and what we can do around that?
I have a sort of very quick point. This is more when you're thinking about it in the policy space. The way we tend to approach it is, one, you need to make sure that the people who are like using it within government are informed customers and just know how far you can or cannot push it. So basic data familiarity, which is always important for any data source. But given that, I also think it's just bearing in mind, it's recognizing it can be the right tool for the right job. So if you treat it as an illustration of what is going on, not a comprehensive absolute truth, and then you triangulate that with other information, how it ties into a story, for a lot of the sort of faster paced areas where we're moving it, that's more than enough. Because in reality, you shouldn't be relying on one data point for that core insight at any one time. It should be like a mixture of things saying, yeah, that looks roughly what's happening. Because even if the representative is really good, ultimately how vacancies move around is reflecting a complicated process. You need to think about what is driving underneath that. And a classic example of that was when we saw that increase in vacancies over the latter part of the summer into the autumn, and that did leave us scratching our heads for quite a while, but it was matched by other sources, so we thought, okay, it is probably true. I think that the more challenging bit is when you start trying to use it for much more crunchy technical work, where that representativeness really can start skewing results, which is much more difficult.
Yeah, no, I see that. So particularly on the point where you were saying around cross-referencing with other sources, I guess at this point you mean cross-referencing with other online job advert sources, or did you mean other wider aspects as well?
No, I think more widely. So it's one, look at all of the online sources you can get your hands on. Two, looking at official stats, because labour market stats at least are faster than lots of other economic statistics. And then three, just tying that into the broader story about what you're going on. So, for example, in the run-up to the first deadline for the UK leaving the EU, it was quite interesting to see some of our priors actually matched in the data, and we saw huge spikes in demand for people who can drive forklift trucks, know how to manage refrigerators or organize warehouses. It's what you expect, but it's really interesting to see it actually start playing out in real time in the data.
Okay, no, thank you. David, I'll pass over to you to see if your thoughts are on representativeness, particularly around the fact that you manage the ONS vacancy survey, and just to remind people to submit questions through the Q&A chat box if they want to, through the bottom of the screen that should appear for them.
Really just echoing the points Mariagrazia and Dan have already said. I think it's really about horses for courses. I mean, my inner statistician screams that, of course, representative matters and you really want to measure everything. But depending what question you want to ask, you want to know about what skills are important within which jobs and how that's trending over time. It probably doesn't matter if you're not measuring every single vacancy. I'd say if you've got enough there to make sure that what you're concluding is robust, that's probably fine. It's where you probably want to get into sort of the more macroeconomic questions around, well, how many vacancies are there compared to the number of unemployed people? Those things start to matter if you have got a particular gap in your data measurement and you have to think about how you might fill that. Again, we know there's certain elements that online data doesn't really pick up fantastically or as well as other areas. But again, it might also depend on what you're trying to measure. So some industries will be very well covered by online job adverts. If you're in the tech industry, you'll probably put everything out online. Whereas something like maybe retail or agriculture, it may be more word of mouth or something put up on a local notice board or something. But I think Dan made a really important point. It's about education. We find that across all labour market data sources, they've all got their strengths and limitations, and it's making sure that people are aware of them and that they're actually using the right tool for the job. So yeah, I think representation is a nice holy grail. We probably won't quite get there because you're always going to be using slightly imperfect data sources. But I think it's what you've got to be clear about what question you're answering, and say make sure you're using a hammer to bash a nail in rather than a spanner or something. Such an analogy.
Thank you. And I guess following up a little bit from that, I had a question around whether any of the sessions or even this discussion so far has made you think about the fact that, we're alluding to benchmarking to other official sources. Can you see a need for any changes to our official statistics to help enable that and how they might balance each other?
I suppose it is to David first.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it's quite interesting. What I found really fantastic about the work we've done with the Zuna was actually acting as I think as Dan said, a bit of a QA on what we were seeing. That we saw basically effectively been going up last 4 or 5 years, and then suddenly it fell off a cliff. And to see that reflected in the Zuna data was actually quite reassuring, because when we saw that happening, it's sort of what you'd expect. But then the questions in your mind is it because COVID, firms have closed, they're not getting the form, we've moved to online data collection, I think forms not getting through or things like that. And to actually have that reassurance of that data source was actually really, really good. So I think actually having something to triangulate against it is very, very useful. And we're always looking at how we can improve our data. In the vacancy survey set up about 18, 19 years ago now. The methodology is still fairly similar. Obviously, as we move towards using more admin data in our business register, that will probably improve again. We have that much better data source there. But probably can't. Yeah, it's having that thought about, well, how good is our data source? Are there any particular industry? So possibly using some of the online stuff to try and QA that. I think it's maybe something that's going to be a long time coming. So this is the first time the vacancies are really thrust into the spotlight, probably since the last recession. And we're finding new ways of looking at it, new ways of using the data. So I think we could probably improve our official data sources, but we're probably at the start of the journey rather than having a sort of definitive roadmap at the moment.
Thank you, David. Mariagrazia, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to come in on another point David made before, that is really like answering the question, what are we capturing? Which is something that I think should really be asked by anybody starting any analysis. So this morning when I saw Powell talking about, you know, trying to assess to what extent the demand for different jobs had changed with the COVID pandemics, I was really like asking a different question, and I didn't see that coming through. And I think it's something that we might need to ask, because it's a very important question for policymakers, and it's like thinking kind of along the intensive versus the extensive margin. So if we think that companies that were posting their jobs online before the crisis are the ones that are posting their jobs online after the crisis, basically we are looking at a change in their demand for skills, right? If we instead consider the possibility, as many argue, although mostly anecdotally, that this crisis is pushing companies to be more, to go more digital, so to get more digital intensive. If they are already digital to some extent, perhaps to go beyond what they used to be, and if they were not, to adopt some time of technological new devices, which normally are digital, to allow for work to be performed and to be managed. Well, then the question becomes, okay, are these new requests for, you know, this new job posting related to new companies that adopt new way of doing things, and therefore companies that are going digital, which signal a much bigger transformation of the market as compared to looking at what certain companies used to do before as compared to after. And that goes also to the, you know, the question that was raised during the presentation today, that is like, let's try, and that Sanjeev has done, that is about, let's try to distinguish the type of firms we are having. And this is something that is possible. It's simply something that in any analysis, and perhaps I apologize if I missed in the analysis this point, that is like, typically they looked at the labor market and see the change in the labor market without paying attention on whether they come from the same agents or not. And again, and going back to the representativeness issue we were talking about before, is the kind of occupations that are represented to a greater or lesser extent into the data, and to what extent we might need to balance this. And the thing is simple. If we talk about overall skill demand, knowing that generally the first three categories, managers, technicians, and professionals, are the ones that are the best represented, we will wrongly infer that the greatest, you know, demand change is happening by picturing on all the occupations these, let's say, the skills that are demanded from these three categories. And this is not correct. And that's why I say these things need to be looked at really in details. And I think awareness from users and producers of statistics and studies is much needed, especially as these data are new. So there is little experience out there to use them. And so the potential is as big as the challenges of using them in the right way. Hence the role of statistical offices also, you know, in making the comparison with what we have continued to see over the years.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And as you say, it links to earlier aspects being shown and the suggestions from people like Sanjeev around linking in new information. So yeah, definitely a longer term focus here. With that, I think we'll open it up to, we have a couple of questions, so we'll open that up. Again, encourage you to fill in if there are other questions that you want to ask of the panelists or to the group as a whole that you think might be relevant. I think we're in a quite unique opportunity that we have producers of this data, analysts of this data, and users from a policy and other perspective all in the same place. But I'll pass it over to Sanjeev, who had the first question.
Thanks, Gueorguie. I think, firstly, very quickly, thanks to Dan, David, and Mariagrazia. Very good points, lots covered. For me personally, one of the things I've said about COVID is virtually nothing is going to be the same post-COVID. There is a massive social, economic, and environmental reset button going on. Mother Nature is telling us, wake up, behave, get yourself sorted, or there's going to be some serious trouble. And I don't think there's anything that's avoided this. So coming more closely to where we are, I think the work that's been demonstrated today, accessing very new data sets, analyzing data sets, is almost very timely. because I'm not convinced that the traditional approaches are going to survive in the same way. They're going to have to change. Measuring and recording vacancies in jobs is probably a lot more easier and people can relate to. Whereas something like the output gap, which is related to jobs, is much more esoteric. Policymakers will want to know post-COVID, are we going to go back to trend productivity growth, whatever that means? Are we going to go to GDP growth on average, whatever that means? Will we have 5% unemployment, etc.? So it is really important now. There's a big challenge for all of us as producers to be more cutting edge. And so obviously the faster indicators fits in with a certain appetite. So coming back to this labour market thing, I think it's changing so quickly. The two things I wanted to draw out was the digitization of recruitment. So there's a lot of software recruitment software being developed. There's a lot of remote hiring going on. We're shifting from the traditional agencies of recruiting to in-house recruiting, to companies' own websites as opposed to agency websites. So there's a digitization of recruitment theme to think about. And then there's a rapid shift to what appeared to be low-skilled jobs and we didn't want to focus on before COVID. And we looked at AI, we looked at IT, all these lovely high-paying jobs that are innovative and going to create economic growth. And the Mr. and Mrs. Average doing the average job got left behind. So with the travel industry, retail, I don't know, entertainment, hospitality, they are being massively hit. There are redundancies, businesses are going bust, etc. I didn't even say manufacturing. So with that, the idea of mass recruitment of cleaners, hospital workers, healthcare workers, home delivery services, these are not innovative jobs. They're not high-tech jobs. These are your steady bread and butter jobs, but they're going to be recruited on volume, mass volume, by companies, not using the traditional approaches, etc. So my summary is, as we move through what is a really exciting, challenging time for us measurement people, do you think the existing data sources are adequate to serve our purpose? Or have we got to move away from some of the traditional and come up with what we call more fancy? Because the labour market out there is not the same. Is that enough for you, George? I've just had a cup of tea.
I think there was a question in the end there.
There was.
No, thank you, Sanjeev. Yeah, I think the point around a challenge to our sources.
Yeah,
Yes.
essentially the data sources versus.
I think that's valid. Yeah, I think probably appropriate to pass that to.
He just dropped out there for me. I see you said my name there.
Yeah, I was going to just open it up perhaps to David first.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Sanjeev. Really, really good point. And again, something that's become apparent with the pandemic, that we have to sort of start either stretching our current data sources or look to new things. I mean, in my area, normally we publish the labour force surveys a 3-month average. We've actually pushed it and started doing weekly LFS data. I mean, the sample size is lower. When you get those big shifts, like we saw the introduction of the first lockdown, it can start telling you a lot more about the labour market. And I think this is where some of the new data sources do come in. It's that timeliness. I mean, I was really impressed with some of the work in the first session this morning around not quite measuring the evolution of the pandemic in real time, but pretty close. You're looking at the development of innovative firms who switched from at-seat catering to doing takeaways, doing deliveries, to be able to measure that, measuring how many people are clicking on a particular job link. So you're getting not just the demand, but potential indication of what the supply is around particular skills, particularly if you look at high-skilled jobs. I think this is the direction of travel. This is where ONS has been looking to go over the last few years with our transformation program, is trying to tap into some of these new data sources. We're talking about online vacancies here. Again, I mentioned before the turnaround we can do with that. Within a week of us getting data, we can publish an aggregate and be showing that week by week evolution. Also, We've also been looking at using RTI data. We're working with HMRC. We've now got flash estimates of employment and earnings coming through from that. So that's within about 2 to 2.5 weeks after the end of the month, we get an estimate. So, and that has proved really, really useful in giving people not quite real time, but again, much closer gap between the end of the reference period and when you get the data. So I think you're exactly right to point it out. It's going to be challenging, but I think that's the direction we're moving in ONS, and I think a lot of the work that was shown here today shows the potential of not just going beyond measuring levels and things like that, but also using this to predict what's going to happen in the labour market coming in terms of skills demands and earnings. So yeah, it's going to be an exciting time.
Thanks, David. Dan, maybe to pass over to you if you had a particular where you might be trying to use this from a policy perspective.
Okay, so from a sort of an analytical policy customer perspective, my answer to that question is no, not yet. And the reason for that, I think, sort of breaks down to a couple of components. Firstly, yes, there is this issue around structural shifts in the labour market, which we aren't always necessarily very good at picking up. But actually, there's a broader point around expectations about what data can and cannot tell us have shifted radically. And a big challenge, not just the ONS, but anyone who's working in data and government faces, is ministers and senior officials live in a world where they think everything is magically available instantaneously. So even beating them back to merely slightly slow is quite a major task. But underlying that is the labour market is changing, and we do need to understand better that this is a point I was going to make actually earlier, but I forgot, in the sense of one of the big points about vacancies data is it allows you to get into like characteristics of jobs in a way we've not really been able to do before. So flexible working, not just pay, but other components of it. And a block in our thinking historically has been we've tended to think about the labour market matching process, this is from a policy perspective, as the right person for the right job, rather than right job characteristics for the person. We tend to go one way, not the other. And I think if you think any of the structural change from COVID will be permanent, the latter is going to become a lot more important because it suggests a slight reconfiguration of the labour market. I think the good news is, even take parking vacancies data, the kind of data we're now starting to be able to play around with, for example, PAYE information from HMRC, there are admin data sources which, if we can link these all together and start triangulating them, give you a lot more granularity and coverage of what is going on much faster than we previously could have done. But I know from talking to my colleagues in the ONS that's a fairly Everest-like mountain to climb to get all that data in. But you could sort of always see the potential there in the future for what we might be able to do.
Mariagrazia, did you want to come on that point around sources and their suitability?
Yeah, and actually I would like to say that we should not try to throw the baby with the bathwater. That is, it's true, there is some limits in terms of the official statistics being provided, in terms of timeliness, for instance, or granularity, which new data are telling us we can overcome in some way. But as I said, I think the best thing we could do is really to put it together. Let's not forget there is a huge value in comparability over time. In order to understand where we are heading to, in addition to having the new data and the data that are very much up to date, we need to understand where we are coming from. I mean, skills, jobs, educational endowment is not something that you've changed from day one to day two, which means that unless we have, we are able to see the thread of where we were and where we are going to, it's going to become very, very difficult to do any kind of policy. And another point that I would like to make is these data, for instance, in this case, job ads, are fantastic because anyway, they were public, you needed only to subscribe. Evidently, all the companies have agreements with the company they scrape on, or they go directly on the companies, fine enough. Let's not forget that real-time type of information often face problems related to privacy and to laws that try to protect citizens about the use of data that pertains to them. So, I mean, we have faced it several times, and I'm sure that nobody here is unfamiliar, unfortunately, with the challenges entailed in matching data or bringing together data from different institutions, let alone from different countries. One of the biggest things that for us is like an unsurmountable type of problem is to pull data from several countries, for instance. In many cases, that has proved impossible. So there are a number of challenges that are anyway there for a good reason, not for a bad reason, not because our national statistical offices are not able, but just because they have to abide by some type of rules that prevent them from collecting or distributing type of information. And in any case, I think whatever we do next, knowing that the world before COVID is not going to look a lot like what we will see afterwards. And I agree with Sanjeev, we do have evidence about, you know, the hollowing out of the middle skilled jobs, so to speak, because we see a picking up of the low skills jobs. We see a picking up of the skilled jobs, but we see that those that really remain behind are mainly those in the middle category. But, you know, even to be sure about that and then implement policies that address this kind of problems, we need to see exactly where we were coming from and where we are heading to. And if there is no comparability, there is nothing we can do in that direction. So I think we have to be really cautious about doing radical shifts to new sources and abandon what has been done so far. Having said that, evidently, there might be a need to reconsider how to develop certain statistics that were compiled also before, and how to collect some type of information, knowing that the digital transformation entails us all, and therefore we can think of different ways to collect data as compared to traditional way of doing surveys or the like. So there is a way also in the methodology of collecting data that may allow us to make them much more timely.
Thank you, Mariagrazia. I was just conscious, so we've had a few more comments and questions, so we'll move on to those. The next one that came through is from Andrew Ward. Andrew, do you want to ask your question? I think he may not be able to come on, so I'll just read out the point. So, okay. So Andrew's point was, where the vacancy data exists as published statistics, the most common request for further developments to inform decision-making we get is for breakdowns by multiple characteristics. For example, vacancies, sector and geography, sector and occupation, geography and skill level. This seems most developed in the education and skill space. For example, the breakdowns that exist in various tools and statistics on geography and skill. So I think that was just a reflection from a production point of view. Next question was from Ilka Tuomi. Ilka, do you want to come in? Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Yeah, do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so greetings from Finland.
Yep.
So I'm currently doing a study for the Finnish Prime Minister's office exactly on the question on how to use labor market information to support career and educational choices. So looking at it from the point of view of, first from the point of view of individuals, how you could build support systems for people who consider how to make choices in these areas. So, in that context, obviously I've been carefully studying all the initiatives in the UK, but in that context, for me, there is a question. I would like to hear your reflection on that. And in a way, Mariagrazia already to some extent replied to that. But my question is that almost all the data that we are using in this LME area is based on standard occupational categorizations. And on the other hand, if we look the history and the present of labor market, occupation sounds like a very 20th century concept. So it's something really kind of that emerges in the industrial society based on the production models and systems in that era. And what I'm seeing today, if I'm asking younger people today, what will you become as an adult? The answer is what do you mean? by an occupation or profession. So we are going to much more kind of fluid occupational structure. What I'm trying to do is to find ways to actually uncover the real kind of life paths of people, and those don't seem to be really clearly related to traditional occupational categories. So job data seems to be quite interesting from a point of view of looking real kind of competence histories. And we heard examples today, like the analysis on skill kind of patterns or skill overlaps and skill adjacencies, which might be more interesting. So my question for you is simply, I mean, we all understand that if you want to have time series data, you need to have history. On the other hand, the categories we use to describe the present and the history are always based on historical needs. And we know that we would probably need something new. And that new could be, in a way, uncovered using natural language processing systems and AI-based systems. So my question for you, what do you think about occupations in this context in the future?
Thank you. Could you, is it targeted at a particular panelist, or are you wanting to hear from everyone?
Well, I think all the panelists have slightly different cuts on this question. So it would be interesting just to have, I mean, there is no answer, I think, for this question. But what is your reaction, I think? That's what I'm looking for.
Well, there might be an answer there.
Okay. Dan, maybe we can start. Oh, no, go ahead. You can start first.
No, go ahead, Dan. No, it was just a remark, but I'll follow.
Okay, so I think my answer to this, it comes with, I think, two parts. So the first off, as a user, particularly if you're not sort of getting knee deep in data, it's a bit like sector data. Sector declassifications are not great, but having them is better than not having anything, because it at least gives you something to hang on to, even if that means different activities move in and out of categories over time. Not least because you're often having to present large amounts of complicated data, and having roughly sensible categorizations to split data out which have common characteristics is useful, even if it's not perfect. However, where I think so the new types of data we're getting have potential a lot of value is if you start collecting this data and you have like a back series of all of these vacancies and you know what occupations these vacancies are stuck into, it tells you things about those occupations. And then in the future, when you have to start revising occupations, when you've got this data source to go back into, and you say, well, we define an occupation as having these characteristics, what jobs had those in the past, what jobs have them now, and it makes it much easier to change occupations at a point in time and then go back through history and revise your occupational definitions. So I think they can go hand in hand. You need the simplicity for policy and basic analysis purposes because you just have to have a first hook to hang on to. But that granularity underneath, A, for pure analysis purposes, and then B, the ability to reconfigure your definitions retroactively over time is actually quite useful.
Yeah, if I can maybe to pick on the point Dan's make, I think, yeah.
That's a really insightful point.
So I think there's a bit of delay there. Go pick up on those points. I think, yeah, having a classification is better than none, but nothing's ever going to be perfect. And having been around ONS over 20 years, I've seen there's quite a few classifications and quite a few revisions to both occupation and industry. And it's a perennial issue that, particularly in fast-moving industries, things change and you're constantly trying to play catch up, and you tend to end up where new things just get put into the other category until you get to the next classification and you update it. So I think having information to be able to retrospectively do it is really, really useful. What I think that things like the near real time and that constantly updating does can also be a signal to when you might need do interim, because quite often we'll do interim updates of our classification rather than doing a whole rewrite of the system. We'll add in some extra granularity at the lowest level, and having this real-time data means we can perhaps do that more frequently and more accurately. We can see if there's any particular occupation or skill set emerging quickly, and that can be a signal to say, actually, we need to start collecting this data individually, and you can do that in a way so you're not waiting for complete reclassification, which often only happens every 8 to 10 years or so, and you can start actually measuring that much more quickly because you've got this signal coming through quite strongly.
Yeah, actually, I fully agree. And I think perhaps the answer is in the fact of not considering jobs and occupational categories as a block, but as kind of a mosaic that is like you have jobs made of a sequence of tasks. And then, of course, you have the tools that have the skills that are able, that allow you to do these tasks. And so if you think in a modular way about occupational categories, then it becomes much more easy over time to do exactly what David is saying, that is like to understand over time how these occupations have changed, whether, you know, the bundle of tasks that these people needed to perform remain the same or have changed. And then you will also start identifying those profiles that are posted where the combination of these tasks differ from anything we know until so far, and that perhaps identify new jobs. That is like, I don't think anybody would have bet like a penny on having influencer as one of the most desired jobs of the millennials, right? We didn't know something like that could exist, okay? But nowadays, if you ask people that are, I don't know, 15, they say, of course, I want to do it, to be an influencer. And so they start posting here and there, and they try to have as many likes as possible and the rest. So, you know, these are, of course, things we could not have been predicted on the basis of strict occupational categories, let's say, considered as a whole. But if you were to look into the tasks and things, then perhaps there would be a different way to get closer to these new profiles that emerge. Now, productivity, the stall of productivity is not going to be changed by how many influencers we have. I'm sorry to, to give this bad news to those that were thinking that it could be their job of their life. But, I think it's important to think more in subsets, and that will allow us really to get, I think, at the core of the problem, also in terms of what are the skills needed.
Thank you all. Yeah, so it seems as if we're unwilling to completely drop off using anything like SOC, but for very valid reasons going forward, even if it might not sit well with how people understand professions in the world. Next question we have is from Zafar. Zafar, do you want to ask your question? I think it's for David as well.
I think he may be having problems with his microphone.
Zafar, can you? Okay, fine. So I'll read that out. So the first question is for David Freeman. Looking back, what would have been the key benefits for economic analysis if you had more prevalent access to online vacancy data during the drop in vacancies at the time following the financial crisis in 2009?
Well, very good question. I think probably the first thing I'd say is that what we're seeing as part of COVID is a little bit different to the financial crisis. I think with COVID, it hit quickly, and there was a very, very big shock that lots of companies sort of temporarily closed. So you did see very much a fall. However, I think for what would have been brilliant is having the granularity again. That at the time of the financial crisis of 2009, we had vacancies by industry size band. It would have been really useful to be able to have something around, well, is this happening uniformly across the country? So is Scotland being affected differently to Wales, differently to London? A bit more granularity around the industry. So was it the financial sector be particularly hit? Was it particular elements of the financial sector? What's the knock-on impact on some of the other industries around that by region as well? So I think it would have been, hindsight would have been brilliant. And you probably pick up some of these things looking back. But I say it's that granularity and potentially the timeliness as well. Although I think that timeliness in terms of COVID is probably more important because things do happen very, very quickly. People go into lockdown overnight and come out of lockdown, and you have things changing quite a lot of the time, where you probably didn't have that in the financial crisis. But I think I would love at the time to have that sort of data at my fingertips to help tell the story.
Great, thank you. And the last question we have is from Graham Atwell. Graham, are you there? Oh no, sorry, we've had one more, but we'll pass over to Graham first.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of the flip side to Ilka's question. One of the things raised a lot of the time is all these new big data sources are all using completely proprietary taxonomies and classification systems, which they're making up themselves, essentially, or making up themselves or deriving from machine learning or whatever. There's certainly one or two people raised the issue that there could be some value for some forms of standardization, which would allow aggregation of data and allow to integrate different data sources from the various big data sets with more official data systems. But who could lead that? I've talked to 3 or 4 different companies about this, and they all say they'd be really willing to take part in such an initiative, but someone's got to start it, and that probably should be governmental bodies. I wonder if anyone, I'm not putting this to any particular person, you've all probably got some opinions on it.
Thanks, Graham. Yes, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's something that, at least being a representative of the ONS, then that seems to sit very nicely with my point of view. But I'll open that up to the panelists if anyone has thoughts.
Well, I think you're hitting a perennial problem. I'm old enough to remember VHS against Betamax in the videotape. And unfortunately, don't really have a market here to where one of those popular. I think it's right. It really does help if you've got those transparent standards, and it's like getting that agreement. I mean, I suppose it does lie with government or government bodies to say, well, okay, what's most useful to most people. But I think there's also, because we're seeing there's a few big players here, it's getting them on board. So I imagine it's more a sort of collaborative approach, that firstly getting the agreement, yes, we want transparent standards, and then possibly for me, people like myself and Dan and our department to put the weight behind that this is really useful. And then someone has, once you've got the standards there, someone has to maintain it as well. So we have to get that to be part of the package too. I mean, we have a team in ONS that sort of specialises in classifications and monitoring and maintaining our classifications database. It's there, but I think it would certainly help if we had those common classification touch points where you can say go to whatever data set you go to. There's that commonality, so you can compare and contrast within the UK, and then you're probably thinking, wider, is there a role for like OECD or ILO to say, well, can we have something international, which would be brilliant.
Well, if I may, I mean, it's already very.
And on that point, just to add on, sorry, a comment from Claudia Plymauer, who was saying how the Commission, so I think the European Commission started the ESCoE project to standardize vocabulary. So there is some allusion to that, but it's, as you say, getting people to sign on. Apologies, Mariagrazia, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Sorry, there must be a big delay here in the voice. What I was just saying is that it's already very difficult to get official statistical offices, national statistical offices, to agree on standards at times, let alone making private companies that edge on these details in order to get part of the market. And let's not forget that many of them cover the same markets. So that's, I think, where the challenge lies, because I think there would be a clear gain to everybody if everybody was collecting data about different countries. But some of the bulk countries for which these data are collected are typically English-speaking countries, which means that very often they cover exactly the same country, so they see themselves as compared. I mean, perhaps we are not the right ones to have to answer this question. The other four that were in the conference today should have answered this question, because we had representatives from 4 important data providers. But I see this like a non-trivial challenge to be dealt with.
Thank you, Mariagrazia. Yeah, I completely agree. It makes sense to have them signed up, and well, that I think I see that as the biggest challenge as well. So the last question we had was from Martin Nowak. Martin, do you want to come in?
Can you hear me? Perfect. So thanks for this very interesting discussion. I want to add something to the 2 things that we just heard, which is this taxonomy question, how to harmonize, how to standardize this. And ESCoE is a project that I'm actually also working in helping to improve with regard to transversal skills and competences, to find a joint taxonomy, and it's multilingual, as you know. But my question is, how do you see the chances of using the same skill taxonomies for both understanding labor market demands on the basis of online job vacancies, and also at the same time for designing education programs and curricula? Because what we are currently discussing is it possible to use the same taxonomy for this, or are these 2 basically very separate languages that you cannot actually bring together, although this might be desirable in the future if education programs are supposed to deliver the supply for the demand? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I think it's a very important point, and it's something that within our team at ONS, it's part of our long-term development plan of trying to link from a skill demand and skill supply side for comparable purposes. But as you say, the challenge is in actually producing the data. So yeah, I'll open that up to the panelists.
Thank you. No one volunteers.
Well, we speak always. Sorry. Go ahead, David, please.
I feel it's a bit of an answer similar to the last question. I think it will be really good if you could have that same language in job vacancies and skills providers and trainers, because then you can start more easily see, or if you're a job seeker, I'd really like to go into that job. What courses can I do? Okay, this job requires these skills. Oh, I can do this course over here because the language is the same. I like the occupation classification. It's difficult to do that squared, because you only got to get training providers on board, and does that then make the expectation of various courses? So I do this course, it will give me the skills for this job, and then you actually go for the job and it doesn't quite match. So I think again, it will be very nice to do, but I think that will be very challenging, because you've got a large number of stakeholders you'd have to get on board. I mean, even in my area where I live, I can think of 4 or 5 further education colleges, and that's in a few miles radius. You multiply that by across the country, and that's quite challenging. I can see the benefits of it, but I can also see it is a big challenge. So yeah, I'd like to see it, but yeah, quite how you go about it, I'm not quite sure. But maybe my fellow panelists might have some ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I would like to add to that the fact that I'm not sure linking directly it's the best thing we can do, in the sense that let's remember that labor demand, I mean, what we get in terms of labor demand from online job posting in part reflects also firm specific characteristics and organizational setting, as well as level of technology adoption, etc. So what we would like to ideally get to is to what you were calling like transversal skills.
Yeah.
And those are the ones I think that we should strive to identify in order then to link better, you know, what we see in terms of demands with what we see in the curricula, and so delivered in terms of educational attainment, but not the specific items that might simply reflect a specific company in a specific location or in a specific sector. And that's why, for instance, I think it is important to look at, we have seen several presenters today looking at network of skills, looking at the correlation, trying to get at the core of the nodes so that we identify those that really are needed by everybody or by most of the market, and those that are corollary. At the end of the day, that will be, you know, the task of the hiring company to endow the worker with certain type of skills if they're not endowed with it already. But it's not something that we should, let's say, ask educational curriculum, whether vocational or any type of other education, to deliver as an output.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariagrazia. Yeah, I mean, linked to that point, Mary O'Mahony had a comment about actually how universities seem to be moving in that direction. And so that could maybe go in a slightly different way as to you saying around these more transversal skills as opposed to these more technical skills. I don't know, Mary, if you had any points on that particular distinction.
Yes, I mean, I think universities have been moving for some time in that direction. I mean, we now look in terms of these kind of overall learning outcomes that students get from their various courses and how they link onto particular skills. And I think we've invested quite a lot of resources in trying to make that, you know, to close the loops on these things. So, and I had an idea of you know, a possible experimental project of web scraping the curriculum for lots of, you know, not just universities, but also FE colleges and looking to see where that match is, and if there's mismatch across the country, I think would be very useful in that. But I think there has been this move for quite some time. So it's the information is out there. It's gathering it is where the difficulty lies.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, no, obviously that's another alternative which doesn't require as many people necessarily signing on if we just want to scrape that data and run a project on that. And we had a point, I think, linked to that same discussion from Eduardo Castelbranco. The EU has a well-advanced system of online job vacancy analysis, OVATE, which covers the EU 28, and this system is managed and led by the EU agency CEDEFOP in partnership with data companies. So thank you for that, Eduardo. It does seem like there is some EU level, at least, consideration for standardization. So with that, we don't have any other open questions. So I think we'll leave it there. Apologies, we've run over quite a bit, but that was because it was quite a helpful and hopefully lively discussion that you found useful. So I'll just take the opportunity to thank you all for staying on for this panel session and for attending the earlier webinars. I want to thank the panelists again, Dan Mawson, David Freeman, and Mariagrazia. Yeah, thank you all. We will send across notes from the earlier sessions, as I say, in the next few days. So with that, thank you very much. Bye all.